Welcome back to the Morning Show here on Arise News. As mentioned earlier in the news, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, ranked Nigeria as the second worst country in the world in the use of sovereign wealth funds in its Fiscal Monitor report. Joining us now to respond to the report is Uche Orji, the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. Uche, good morning. Hello, Uche, good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Welcome to the Morning Show. Well, earlier, as I said in the introduction, we had been talking about the IMF accusing Nigeria of very low sovereign wealth fund utilization, and also talking about not having, a strong institutional framework, corruption, lack of transparency, abuse of discretion. And you are the CEO of the body established in 2011 to manage the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Three funds, the Future Generation Fund, the Infrastructure Fund, and the Stabilization Fund. Now, I think you have now an opportunity to reply to the IMF. I don't know whether you have studied the report.
Yes, I did. I saw the report yesterday. But first of all, let's establish one thing. The report is not a report against the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. It's a report against the overall use of revenues from things like crude oil and excess crude oil sales. So it's not, there's hardly any mention of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. So let's make sure we establish that point. It's a generalized sweeping report about how countries use revenues, and the use of the word sovereign wealth fund in that ranking, obviously, never even ranked or talked about the NSIA. So I think it's important that we establish that. But let me get to a few things on the report. I think the first is that the report, it's not a ranking in that true sense. It doesn't use IMF data. I'm actually personally disappointed that the IMF will use third-party data, not their own data, and couple it together. And actually, the data itself has no correlative value. On the one hand, you have assets under management to GDP ratio, and then you have governance. Two of them, data from two different agencies, not the IMF. And then, of course, it gets wrapped under the banner of the IMF, and everyone thinks it's an IMF. It is, of course, an IMF report, but the disappointing thing is if you're going to rank institutions, do the work yourself, use your own data. So that, let's even establish that as a fact. So it's something against the NSIA itself. It's against the way countries use revenues from their natural resources. Now, to the Sovereign Wealth Fund commentary. There are three things one needs to say. The first is, if you look at that data, there's always been a fundamental dislike from institutions such as the IMF, of course, against the use of funds from the Sovereign Wealth Funds for domestic investment in things like infrastructure. So I'll give you an example. If you look at the funds highly ranked on the left-hand side, these are funds that actively do not invest in their domestic economy. The funds that are lowly ranked, like Nigeria, Qatar, UAE, are funds that invest in their own domestic economy. Now, there's a whole body of work that argues for the use of your revenues to invest in your domestic infrastructure. And that's a fundamentally different philosophy than what the IMF will espouse, because the IMF is keen on stabilization. So ideally for them, it is about putting your money in a foreign reserve account and then using it for stabilization only. Unfortunately, the NSIA Act disagrees with that. The NSIA Act simply says we're going to have three ring-fence funds: the Stabilization Fund, the Future Generations Fund, and the Nigeria Infrastructure Fund. It doesn't make any sense if a country with significant infrastructure needs puts its money in Switzerland or puts its money in Washington and does not use it for its own infrastructure needs, especially if they're commercially viable. So the NSIA's Act was very clear about the commercial viability of the projects we invested, which is why the NSIA has had 5 straight years of profitability. And we're on track to have a 6th year of profitability. We're publishing our results by Monday or Tuesday next week. You will see annual reports. Now, down to the issue of governance. The NSIA Establishment Act was very clear on its governance, very, very clear. There's a 6-man independent board of directors that through 5 committees overlook every aspect of the NSIA's work. That's number one. Number two, we go through 6 audits a year. 4 quarterly audits by PricewaterhouseCoopers, 1 by the Accountant General and 1 by the Auditor General. All of these audit reports are published. 3, within the operations of the organization itself, frankly, I think we've been held up as one of the best-run sovereign wealth funds in the world. The IMF work has not actually engaged in detail to understand how sovereign wealth funds work. The Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute has done that work. And in doing that work, the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute has put NSI in the top quartile for transparency and governance. There's actually, I think, a month ago, an interview by the secretary of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, yet another umbrella body for sovereign wealth funds, that held up the NSI as one of the better-run sovereign wealth funds in the world. So I just want to make sure that these facts are put out there and is clear, and also establish that the IMF report is not an attack on the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. It's actually an attack on how countries use their revenues. But institutions that have detailed understanding of sovereign wealth funds operations, like the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute and the IFSWF, have always put the NSI in the top quartile for transparency and governance. So these are facts that I want to lay out there, and that's my reaction to the report. And I've had words with the IMF seeking clarifications. Thank you.
Indeed, what exactly would you have preferred the IMF to do in this situation? Because although it did not mention the Sovereign Investment Authority, it did talk about lack of transparency as we have established. So what exactly do you say that they should have done differently?
Well, I think what they should have done differently is do the work, first of all. Coupling up third-party data and creating a report is, for lack of a better word, flippant and lazy, to be honest. Do your work. Well, I mean, engage with the sovereign wealth fund organizations themselves.
Yeah, you keep making this point.
Engage with sovereign wealth fund institutions themselves.
Yeah,
What's that?
You keep making this point about the IMF using third-party data. Are you questioning the integrity of the national, Resources Governance Institute?
I'm just saying, if you...
No, just a moment.
No, I'm not questioning. I'm just saying that there are two different sets of data that have no correlative value. If you are talking about getting into the detail of the organizations, engage with the organizations. We publish our reports actually more than most. 4 audited reports every year, and investment policy statements are published. In fact, we have a senior member of the World Bank who has been with the NSIA for the last 4 years, working on as the portfolio manager for infrastructure fund and secondment from the World Bank. And we worked with the World Bank 2 years ago on a transparency matrix. So I just want to be clear about my defense of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Nigeria versus IMF's report. If you want to do the work and do rankings, do the work yourself, is the point I'm making. We never engage with any of these institutes. The ones we engage with have their assessments of the NSIA, and I think those are assessments that we've always been very proud of. For 5 years in a row now, we've been in the top quartile for transparency and governance by the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute. And I think these are the people that actually interact with sovereign wealth funds on a day-to-day basis, on a much more regular basis. And we never really engage with any of these institutes that you're talking about.
Well, beyond this conversation, are you likely to take steps to engage the IMF directly and provide, alternative data?
Oh, no, we have. We've just sent our response to the reports. And frankly, also, like I said, let's be mindful of the fact that we were not attacked directly in the report. So we need to be very careful how we contextualize that. But the reality is that I think it's important that the facts about the operations of the NSI is put clear and on the table. And I think this is something we're very, very sure to make sure that people understand, especially our stakeholders. Well,
the IMF was also talking about assets, the management of assets. And you are saying that, sure, they are not referring directly to the NSIA. But how strong are we, yes, on all the 3 funds? Because you mentioned domestic infrastructure.
Sure.
Many Nigerians listening to you will say, well, we don't, sure, see what we've done with the funds for infrastructure. And then what's the quality, the level of our investment? Sure. I think that information will be useful, sure, to the average Nigerian listening to you.
So, absolutely. So I said, number one, the commercial viability of the investments we make are things we need to be very clear on. We're on the 6th year of profitability on all 3 funds. The Future Generations Fund and the Stabilization Fund invest internationally, so they get affected by international events. And we're in a diversified pool of assets from private equity, public equity, alternatives, hedge funds, and the like. and cash investments as well. We have been consistently profitable. I think the last year that just ended, we reported something close to, we are reporting something close to, on average, 40 billion naira in profits, with the stabilization fund actually doing very well because we've been very lucky in terms of the treasury investments we made as well as corporate bond investments we made globally. And in a rising interest rate environment, that has actually helped the stabilization fund. The Future Generations Fund had a very volatile year last year, partly because of what's happened with the global equity markets, but it was also modestly profitable because private equity investments returned fairly solid numbers for the Future Generations Fund. Now, on the infrastructure fund, we've been very clear. We've been very careful and very slow, but very deliberate as well as investments we've made. We've invested in healthcare. I think people can attest to the fact that we've commissioned a few healthcare programs, and those will actually strike a good balance between social returns and commercial returns. We've also recently invested in roads projects. As you're very much aware, the NSIA, through as managers of the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund, are the ones responsible for both the Second Niger Bridge, which has gone quite far, Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, which some parts of it are 30 to 40% completed, Abuja-Kano Highway. Those are the 3 road projects that are actively under management of the NSIA. Those are all slated for completion between the end of 2021 and the end of 2022, those 3 projects. In power, recently we've taken on a renewable energy project in Kano, and also the NSIA has been named through the PIDF as the managers of the Mambila project, hydropower project. That will take a long time to construct. That's about 4 to 5 years of construction for that project. We've also been managers of the Presidential Fertilizer Initiative, which is something that has actually added real value in this country. We've cut down the significant amount of subsidy used for fertilizer, at the same time made it available at a very reasonable price, through reviving all the blending plants in the country. These things were abandoned for many years, and what was happening was we were importing products into the country. So all of these are the efforts of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. I can talk about more. We've created institutes that actually helped drive the investment in infrastructure in the country. We sponsored the Infra Credit, which is now an institution that is helping pension funds invest in infrastructure. It was owned by the NSI 100%. Recently, we've had other investors join us. AFC, KFW, and more recently, the AFDB are all now investors in the Infra Credit, Infrastructure Credit Guarantee Company. That is a company that was owned, sponsored by the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. We also were the anchor investors in Nigeria Mortgage Refinancing Company, the Development Bank of Nigeria, as well as the Family Homes Fund. So these are all the things that the NSIA has done in infrastructure. And we publish these things regularly, and we interact with the press regularly on all of these projects, and many more, quite frankly. I couldn't name all of them on this short period we have for the show. But my encouragement to you is pick up the annual reports of the NSIA, and you see all the activities that the NSIA has been involved in. But at the same time, we've been consistently profitable. And I think that's something that we need to be very mindful of, because it takes a little bit of balancing to achieve that.
Indeed. Well, let me ask you about potential political interference in the work you do. How rife is that? Because concerns have been raised.
About what?
Political interference in the job you do at the NSIA.
Concerns about interference?
Yes. In the past, I mean, we've had government interfering in the sovereign...
Interference?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, I think our interaction with the government is I will say, healthy. First of all, our stakeholders are the government, both federal and the subnationals. So in the Governing Council of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, you have, obviously, the federal government that owns somewhere between 48 and 52%, depending on the source of capital. Then you have all the state governments and all the local governments. And so we have a regular interaction with them every year to show them our reports. And as every stakeholder, they will also state their requirements and desires, especially with regards to domestic infrastructure. And so we have a collaborative relationship in how we address some of these desires. And where we can, and where it's within our act and within our mandate, of course, we'll support them. If it's not, we will not. And so we have an annual interaction during the Governing Council meeting with all the agencies of government, and as with every stakeholder. There are matters they're happy with, and there are matters they're not happy with. But that is a healthy interaction. Secondly, obviously, is the fact that our board is appointed, obviously, by the stakeholders. And so these are all things, in my opinion, that I think are normal. This is not an entirely 100%, it is not a private sector company. No, let's be clear about it. It's owned by government. But the way the law has set it up is such that the government plays an advisory role. The government interacts with us in terms of stating their needs and we understanding. And the law actually says we should, as much as possible, work in tandem with the objectives of the government. So that's really how we're set up. The fund is set up to solve Nigeria's problems, frankly, and I think people need to respect that. So interference, as a word, is one of those buzzwords that creates, in my opinion, what I would used to call an undifferentiated panic. The reality is that we interact, and we're encouraged, and we must interact actively, especially with regards to pushing for more capital contribution to the NSIA. One of the things that's come up in the IMF report, obviously, is the asset under management as a ratio of the GDP. We are small, very small. But I think the important thing is that we should establish a consistent process of contribution to the NSIA. That, I think, is the most important thing. It's far more important than having sporadic big-size contributions. The consistency of contribution will allow us over the next 20, 30, 40 years to build a significantly sized fund. Most people compare the NSIA to funds from the Middle East. But most of those Qatar, for example, has been in operation since 1956, I believe. UAE, 1976. The NSIA just barely started in 2012 as a business. And so if we can consistently contribute to the NSIA, no matter how little, I think it will allow it to build a fund for a future generation, which is really the objective. So 6 years of operation, yes, so far so good. I think the organization, the management and the board have proven that they can actually run this fund. But I think our interaction with government is necessary to ensure consistent contribution for the future of the NSIA.
Well, let me ask you again about the fund. You already told us some of the things you've been doing, particularly with domestic infrastructure. But what is the value of each fund?
Yes.
And I ask this question in the light of a related report by the World Bank complaining about the abuse of discretion, about the depletion of the excess crude account, and all of that. What is the value of each fund at this moment?
So the value of each fund, so if you look at the contribution to the fund, we've had in total contribution by the government $1.5 billion. We also manage on behalf of agencies of government and direct initiatives of the government. We manage something in the order of $800 million. So at the moment, altogether, it's about it's actually about $2.6 billion, including the returns we have earned over the last 5 years of operation. So core assets of the NSI contribution by the government is $1.5 billion. Third-party assets being managed on behalf of the government is about $800 million. Then the returns earned by the NSIA over the last 5 years brings us to something about actually, to be exact, is $2.53 billion. Those are the numbers that we have as both assets under management and assets under administration of the NSIA. So it's grown, it's not depleted. Now, I can't speak to the excess crude account. I'm not in charge of the excess crude account, but I can speak to the NSIA, where I can categorically state every single year for the last 5 years, each of those funds have grown through profitability. Again, it's a delicate balance we must strike. This fund can only be sustainable if it is profitable.
Okay, well, let me ask you just one more question before we bring this to a close. And again, I go back to the IMF report with which we started. The IMF is also saying that African countries should be careful how they borrow from China. And that, when they take those loans, they should make sure that everything is in conformity with the Paris Club arrangements. Otherwise, they could discover down the line that they've taken loans that they cannot sustain and pay back. We have the example of Djibouti. We have the example of other countries in East Africa, Central Africa, who have had issues with Chinese loans. What's your take?
No, I think it's a very generic advice, frankly, and it makes sense. But it makes sense for every loan you take, whether you take the loan through the Eurobond market as a bond issuance, or it's a loan, bilateral loan with China or any country. The most important thing is that the country needs to be very clear that A, it needs a loan, and B, it can apply it in sustainable investments that actually can generate enough returns to pay. if you do not have enough cash flow to service your debt, you'll be broke. It's that simple, whether you're an individual, a small business, or a country. And so the idea is to make sure you pace yourself. And I think that's a generic advice. There's not really special in the advice, to be honest with you. In Nigeria, I believe that, and I can't speak for my bosses, but I also can speak for the fact that I think there's been a careful pacing of the loans being taken. And we must ensure that we have enough cash flow as a country to service whatever debt we take. We've had our views about this in the past, but so far, in my opinion, I think the IMF advice is generic. And it makes sense, to be honest, it does.
Well, thank you very much, Uche Orji, CEO, Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. Thank you very much for your time.